question at any time, or if you prefer to put it in the chat as well, I'll try to take a look at that. So thank you so much, Ardith, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As I mentioned to Ardith before I came online, I normally wouldn't do a talk like this from a coffee shop, but I had to be up in Denver. I had a test for first-degree black belt in Kung Fu this morning, and it was supposed to happen last Sunday. And of course, because of the snow, it got delayed. So they said, well, can you do it next Sunday? And I said, yes, I can, but I have an appointment at 1 o'clock, so I need to get that out of the way. So I was prancing and leaping and jumping around today early in the morning. And now I'm happy to see all of you. My name's Colin McAllister. I think as Ardith mentioned, I'm a professor at UCCS in the Visual and Performing Arts Department. So the majority of my background is as a guitarist and a conductor. I also teach our music history sequence, and I teach in our humanities program. And for about the last 6 or 7 years, I have been researching quite a bit into the field of apocalypticism, hence the talk today, and actually published the Cambridge Companion to Apocalyptic Literature last year. So my talk today is going to, obviously it's about music, but it's also with this intersection with apocalyptic literature and with apocalypticism more broadly. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. And like I say, I want to keep this informal. And so I invite people to ask questions or to jump in at any time. Doesn't have to be like a college lecture to my students. All right, so hopefully you all are now seeing my screen, and I'm going to play my PowerPoint slide here. Ardith, can you just log onto your microphone and just confirm that you all can see this okay? Because now I can't see you. So.
Yeah, I can see it.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, now that I'm in my PowerPoint slide here, I can't see the chat right now, so I'll try to come back to that. But anyway, I'm titling my talk today, Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Music in the Apocalyptic Mode. And this title is actually the title of a book that I'm co-editing with a colleague from Montreal that's all about music and apocalypticism. So if we break down this title that I've put there in front of you, a very academic sounding title, the Dies Irae, Dies Illa part, some of you may be familiar with that. It's actually the title of a 13th century Latin hymn that was part of the Requiem Mass for the dead in the Roman Catholic Church until the reforms of Vatican II in the 1960s. And it's kind of a Day of Judgment sort of text. Here's the first few lines in Latin. Dies Irae, Dies Illa, solvet saeclum in favilla, teste David cum civila. And Dies Irae actually means the day of wrath. So you see this text, it's talking about the end time. It's talking about the final judgment. And this hymn itself, some of you may be familiar with the sound of it. It's been used in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, which is a wonderful work from the early 19th century. And then it's also been used in the score to The Shining, which of course is a Stanley Kubrick horror movie based on a Stephen King book. And I'm just going to click on this. I hope this will play and you'll hear the sound. I know coming through Zoom sometimes is not ideal, but you should be able to hear this. Could you all hear that okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Did anybody recognize that theme, this kind of dark and ominous theme? Maybe some of you have heard that before. So that is the Dies Irae. So we've got the Dies Irae, Dies Illa, and then we have music in the apocalyptic mode. Well, mode is a type of scale. So in ancient Greece, you hear music theoreticians, including Pythagoras and Plato, talking about the different kinds of modes. Plato in the Republic actually says things like the Dorian mode is suitable for warriors because it incites the martial spirit, whereas other modes are not good for listening for warriors because they'll encourage laziness and not a will to fight. So that's a mode. The last word, apocalyptic, is maybe a little bit harder to get at. So I want to look at that. And maybe some of you can just think about when you hear the word apocalypse, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? This is obviously a church-going crowd, so probably the kinds of things that you might think about are different from the kinds of things, say, a typical class of college students would think about. But some folks think of, well, secular popular cultural novels, dystopian or apocalyptic novels like Huxley's Brave New World, all the way up to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, right? Christian fiction, the Left Behind franchise, which probably most of you have either heard of or maybe read some of, a very popular series of books by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, where in these books, it's sort of a fictional retelling of a very literal view of the book of Revelation. Of course, that spun off lots of successive novels and a few really bad movies. Environmental collapse, right? The end of the world, an asteroid hits us, or global warming destroys us. Technology destroys us, right? This is a very common apocalyptic theme. If you remember those Terminator movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? That the humans have been almost destroyed by artificial intelligence, or a nuclear bomb goes off, right? The idea that technology destroys us. When people hear the word apocalypse, a lot of times that's what they think.
Yeah.
Predictions of the end. If you remember Y2K, which all of us do, some of my students don't. They were too young for the Y2K crisis, right? The idea that maybe because the computers couldn't understand that turn of the century, that they were all going to shut down and we were all going to lose our bank accounts and everything else. More recently, the Mayan apocalypse of 2012, where some folks predicted that the world was going to end. Harold Camping. Anybody remember Harold Camping? He was that fellow who took out some billboard ads, maybe back in 2013 or so, and predicted that the end of the world was going to happen. Of course, it didn't. I think he died a few years later. Presidential elections, right? Every time there's a presidential election, no matter whose side you're on, some group of people, maybe those whose candidate didn't get successfully elected, feel that the world is going to end because the new candidate is just going to do terrible things, right? Warnings from grouchy relatives. Well, one of my students one time in this class that I teach at the university, I was asking students this same question, and she raised her hand and she said, well, when I was a little kid, my grandma always said that if we didn't eat our vegetables, that the second coming was going to happen and we'd be thrown into eternal damnation. So I guess that's a warning from a grouchy relative. And then, of course, we have this idea that we see sometimes in popular media, of course, of cults, or now sometimes they call them neo-religious groups, who have tragic endings based on some kind of end of the world thinking. And this includes Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Guyana in 1978, the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas in 1993, and then Heaven's Gate, also in the 1990s, a group of folks who ended up killing themselves because they thought that Jesus was coming back behind a comet, and that if by killing themselves, they would be taken up to this spaceship and they would be saved in the next life. So we have very, of course, dark realizations of apocalyptic thinking. Let's see here. This is one to show myself again. All right. But a long time ago in a land far away, and I think probably most of you know this, revelation or apocalypse comes from this Greek word, apocalypsis, which literally just means a revelation or an unveiling. And that's why, of course, the last book of the New Testament is called both the Book of Revelation or the Apocalypse of John. Those words, apocalypse and revelation, mean the same thing. The Greek word actually comes from the word for unveiling a bride at her wedding. So that's really what the word apocalypse is. And apocalyptic speculation in literature, in music, in popular thought is really a response to seemingly insurmountable scenarios. You know, usually this kind of thinking evolves because we or a group of people feel that they're in a situation that they cannot resolve themselves. Right? Now, I'm going to just pause because I want to see all of you here. I want to see if I can get over to this. Do I have to stop sharing? Okay, now I can just see all of you for a minute. So before I go, because it's weird when I'm speaking to the screen and I can't see any of you, I'm just looking at the slides. So how many of you are familiar with any apocalyptic literature? Anybody in here read the book of Revelation from front to back? Okay, I see Jim raising his hand. That was part of his job. He had to know that book of Revelation, right? But there are other examples. There are other examples. That's the most famous bit.
I have to preach on it sometimes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. You know, that's of course the most famous one because it's actually in the Bible. Now, the only other real section of extended apocalyptic literature in the Bible is the book of Daniel, the second half of the book of Daniel, where Daniel has these visions and then he asks for them to be interpreted. And so he finds out what these visions are supposed to mean. But some of you may also know that in the Synoptic Gospels, there's this part called the Olivet Discourse, or the Little Apocalypse, sometimes it's called. It's when Jesus is on the Mount of Olives, and he starts off and he says, you know, look around you here. You see all these stones that are standing? He's at the temple, right? He says, I tell you, all of these stones will be torn down. And then he goes on to give other predictions about the end times. There are also apocalyptic passages in some of the Old Testament prophets, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, certainly. But the apocalypse, and I'm going to go back and share my screen again here so that you can see my PowerPoint again. Apocalypse was actually a fairly predominant literary genre in antiquity, right? Here's some things that I've mentioned: Book of Daniel, Book of Revelation, the Sibylline oracles. Now, these other books are not books that made it into the canon of the Bible, and so they're not as well known, but they were written around the same time. There's passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the Apocalypse of Enoch. There's one called 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch. These are all standalone apocalyptic texts that have remarkable resemblances to, say, the book of Revelation, but because they didn't make it into the Bible, they're obviously less well known. And as I mentioned, there are passages in other biblical texts, right, including 2nd Thessalonians, which has a passage. 2nd Thessalonians chapter 2 has a long digression about the coming of this like sort of final evil figure, like a prototypical Antichrist, although Antichrist by name is not mentioned in that passage. And this literary genre coalesced from ancient Near East wisdom literature, vision and dream literature, prophetic tradition. All of those types of literatures are very similar to apocalypses proper. And one of the things that I've always argued is that apocalyptic thinking has had a profound influence on world history from the beginnings of when these books were written in the 2nd or even 3rd century BC to the present day, right? If you go down to Barnes and Noble right after you get off this talk with me and go to the Christian section there, I guarantee you'll find not only fictitious interpretations of the book of Revelation, but I'm sure that you'll find a book on the shelf that says that, you know, Pope Francis is the Antichrist and the Vatican is going to come and end the world. And, you know, you can find it's still a very popular mode of discourse. All right. We already talked about that. I'm going to get to music here in just a second, but I want to just finish defining apocalyptic. So apocalyptic writing is predicated on a dualistic worldview that, number one, there is a perfect world of God that's present in our world, but on the other hand, that this imperfect world that we live in has trouble seeing God in it. Apocalyptic writers, and this includes John, the revelation of John, these apocalyptic writers claim to see signs revealed by God. Some tell of a coming Messiah who will save the world. Some tell of a coming judgment where the righteous will be separated from the unrighteous. Some tell of a final battle between good and evil. Of course, the book of Revelation has all of these aspects in it. So one condition of apocalyptic thinking, and by the apocalyptic thinking, I mean that, you know, if you have to be in that mindset, you have to hold an apocalyptic worldview to produce a piece of apocalyptic literature or music, right? One condition is that this world is unjust and immoral, but that the just and moral one will redeem it in the end. And furthermore, the end is redemptive in the sense of a deliverance from our present reality, right? That's the promise of the book of Revelation. At the end, that the new Jerusalem will come and this imperfect world will be resolved. Let's see here. So this is, there's a lot going on in this slide, I guess. Working with my colleague, Lorenzo Di Tommaso, up at Concordia University in Montreal, of course, we're interested in studying apocalyptic music or music that has this aspect of apocalypticism in it. So we have to work to try to delineate and define exactly what this is. And so this, I would say, is a definition of apocalypticism or the apocalyptic worldview that's a little more broad, that's a little bit divorced from its purely religious context. So the apocalyptic worldview, you could say, is a distinctive combination of propositions or axioms about space-time and human existence. It holds that there is a transcendent reality, which defines the cosmos and everything in it, that the present reality is structured by two antagonistic and irreducible forces. And these are typically identified with good and evil, but it can also be identified with light and darkness, or we the elect, we the saved versus everyone else who's not in our group. That the final resolution of the conflict between these forces is both necessary and imminent. Imminent just means it's happening in the near future. And that it is also redemptive in the sense of a deliverance from the present reality. And lastly, this apocalyptic worldview further assumes that the revelation of these mysteries orients our existence and helps give life meaning and purpose, certainly to those who follow in that regard. Okay, I'm going to come back out here. Before I go on to the music part, I just want to see if anybody has any questions or comments about what apocalypticism is, what apocalyptic literature is, or what that worldview is about.
So I have a question about that. Is it typically a positive view or a negative view, or is it neutral?
That's a great question, Bill. I think it's both. Because so it's I would say I don't know if it's positive. I think it's a negative worldview because it takes away human agency. It assumes in a way that we humans are powerless to control the path towards making things better here on Earth, towards moving towards a more utopian society. It assumes that there necessarily has to be some kind of divine eruption into this world to break the bad things that are happening and change it for the better. Now, most, you look at the book of Revelation, let's talk about that since that's the best well known. That was written to a group that's in crisis. It was written to a group of early churches in what's now modern day Turkey, right? The churches of Smyrna and so forth. These churches were experiencing some kind of persecution. They're early Christian groups that are trying to make themselves established. And so at the beginning of Book of Revelation, you might remember there's a series of letters to these 7 churches where John says things like, hey, you Smyrnans, I can see that you're doing all right, but on the one hand, you're slacking off a little bit in these things, and I'm encouraging you to, step up a little bit more. And then, of course, there's this whole series of visions, most of which are very destructive, but at the end of Revelation is hopeful. So apocalyptic worldview is hopeful in the sense that if you believe that you are in the elect, that you will be saved in the end, even if everybody else is not. So to go back to your question, I mean, I can't see it as a positive worldview. In some ways, it may be hopeful. And all of these apocalyptic texts are generally written to groups that are experiencing some kind of crisis, that feel that they're being oppressed by, could be the Roman Empire, right? Back in that day. It could be, David Koresh and his group felt that they were being oppressed by the United States of America, and that America was sort of this evil figure and that they needed to fight against it, and believe that eventually they were going to be saved.
Colin, are you going to say something about QAnon theory?
No, I don't know a whole lot about QAnon theory. So I'll probably stay away from that because I do want to talk about music. But Jim, did you have something you wanted to say about QAnon that's related to?
Well, just that the QAnon theory, it seems to me it fits right into this tradition of other apocalypticisms just perfectly. Forces of good and evil. Trump and his folks are on the side of good. Biden is on the side of evil. There's supposed to have been some sort of reversal of fortune in March. I think it's supposed to take place on March the 7th. It would just seem to me that there's a long tradition of this kind of worldview.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Jim. And you mentioned a key aspect of it is this sort of really dualistic world vision. Let's divide things into 2 camps. There's nothing in between, right? It's Trump and his supporters, all of them are horrible and evil. And Biden and all of his supporters are good, or the opposite.
Right? The other way.
Right? The other way around, right? So there's and I think that if we see the direction, say, of the way that politics has evolved in our social media age, you do see more of this really unfortunate polarity between groups. I think because it's easy to hide behind the screen and it's easy to make comments, whereas, of course, you step out of your house and you're in the real world and it's not that way at all, right? So that's a great point, Jim. And Bill, I thank you for that question. Are there any other questions about, somebody has their hand raised. Is that you, Wendy?
Yeah, it is me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, it often helps me understand a concept if I can have pointed out to me contrasting visions. So could you name some contrasting visions of the world?
Oh, sure. So a contrasting vision would be that you feel that humankind, that we are able, that we can continually improve our society and improve the world, that we can make a more just and moral society through our own efforts, that we can solve the problems here on Earth, we can control climate change, and that we don't need God to come in or some higher power to come in and set things right. So if you believe in, I think if you really believe in human progress, you probably wouldn't hold an apocalyptic worldview, because you would believe that we as humans have the agency to solve our issues by ourselves. Does that help, Wendy? A little bit. All right, well, we came to talk about some music, right? So let's go to music. So I'm kind of setting the stage, and I'm trying to in a way show you kind of my journey as a scholar, because I was very interested. I got into studying apocalyptic literature through the Latin language because I'm a Latinist, and I found some untranslated commentaries on the book of Revelation from the medieval period. And so I started working on that. On the other hand, here I am playing guitar and conducting modern repertoire. And I sort of lived this dual personality, right? And eventually I said, I want to try to find a way to connect these, right? Is there a connection between what I'm doing as a guitarist and what I'm interested in studying some of this old literature, right? And so that's where I kind of got into this music part. So I'm gonna go back in here now, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end as well. I guarantee it. I'm gonna go. Let's see what I have to do. Share. I tell you, I'm getting better and better at this Zoom manipulation. By the time I finally master it completely, this pandemic will be over, and I won't be able to use my skills anymore. But let's see if I can. All right, here we are. So going back to apocalypticism in music. All right, what does that mean exactly? So obviously there's lyrical content. That's the easiest, right? If you take a text literally from the book of Revelation, or like the Dies Irae, and you set that to music and you have that lyric, well, of course the lyric expresses that worldview. So we might have what we call biblical or traditional apocalyptic music. This could be everything from Lutheran hymns to settings of the Mass that have a text that's apocalyptic in nature, right? All the way back to this Dies Irae. Or to more traditional, not more traditional, more contemporary, right? If you go to a big mega church now, right? You go over, say, to New Life Church or something, they probably have something that resembles a rock band that plays on Sundays. And they might have a song where they're singing about Jesus coming back at the end time, or the hope of the New Jerusalem, right? That's an apocalyptic lyric content. There's also secular uses of these things. And I'm gonna come back to that in a minute. And then in a second broad category might be music itself. Because as a musician, when I hear the word music, I'm not thinking about lyrics, right? To me, that's the lyrics, right? The music is what's happening with the sounds. So instrumental music for me is obviously a big concern. And so is there a way to think about this playing out of this apocalyptic mode in purely instrumental music? That's another interest. So you think about biblical traditional apocalypticism. Obviously, we've got medieval settings like the Dies Irae. There's lots of Calvinist and Lutheran hymns that talk about the Jesus coming back and that sort of thing. Obviously, African American blues and spirituals are hugely rooted in this kind of tradition, as is reggae and Rastafarianism, right? That music has a lot about looking toward a future that's been redeemed by God, right? Christian apoc rock, that's my term for the New Life Church modern band that has apocalyptic music. Heavy metal music, if any of you are into black or death metal, that's probably not the case in this group, but I don't want to guess. A lot of my students are into this kind of music. Those kinds of groups will appropriate a lot of the imagery and tropes from the book of Revelation, right? One, you think of, when I say tropes, I mean, what are some common images from the book of Revelation that are prevalent in secular society? Well, certainly 666, the number of the beast, right? Or the 4 horsemen, maybe, of the apocalypse. Those might be things that are known to lots of people, even who have no idea really about the book of Revelation itself. Secular apocalyptic music. Bob Dylan. If you look at some of Bob Dylan's music, especially he had, early on in his career, his music was, of course, very engaged with the social justice issue and a rising up and a kind of overthrow of a society that was on top, that was unjustly perhaps on top. Then he had this kind of middle phase where he went through kind of an evangelical Christian, and he has some lyrics that are very apocalyptic sounding. In this song, Man of Peace, off this album, Infidels, he talks about an almost antichrist figure who will come back. He says, he's going to usher in 1,000 years of peace. Of course, Antichrist is the great pretender to Christ. So, and I think he even says sometimes Satan comes disguised as a man of peace. So Bob Dylan, believe it or not, has some of these aspects in his music. I already mentioned Bob Marley. We could talk a lot about Rastafari as a movement and some of the lyrics of Bob Marley. If any of you are Bob Marley fans, for instance, Ride Natty Ride is a song that talks about redemption, that talks about this world going up in flames, and that the Rasta man will lead the way forward to a new epoch of justice and of fairness. All right, now I want to turn to instrumental music, because of course this is where I'm really interested in this area. So Ricard Wagner, great composer of the 19th century, wrote all of these really long operas, right? If you've ever listened to Fledermaus, or you've listened to the Ring Cycle, or the Flying Dutchman, or especially this opera, Tristan und Isolde, right? What Wagner does in this opera is very interesting. I need to come back out of this for a sec, because I want to ask all of you, first of all, do you understand what tonality in music is? Do we have some musicians in the room here? See some folks maybe nodding their heads. Yeah, Marilyn, raise your hand. Okay. So tonality in music is this idea of a home base. So now I don't have my guitar with me, but if you play a certain sequence of chords and you don't come back to home base, it sounds like something doesn't quite make it back, right? If you sing Happy Birthday, you sing Happy Birthday, dear, dun, dun, and then you just end it there, most people will be a little itchy. They'll say, no, you need to come back and sing dun, 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 and end on the tonic. So in music, you have this primary opposition. Again, if we want to think of it as dualistic, between the tonic chord, the home bass, and something called the dominant chord. Those of you who are musicians, if you know, for instance, the C chord and the G7 chord, that's tonic and dominant. And the dominant chord has tension within it. It's a dissonant chord. It wants to resolve back to the tonic. And so if you don't resolve back to the tonic, it propels this sense of tension. So what Wagner did in his music of the mid-19th century is he prolonged the resolution of this tension. And in the case of Tristan und Isolde, which is sort of a Romeo and Juliet type love story, he introduces these tension-filled chords at the beginning of the opera, and it doesn't get resolved until all the way at the end, almost 4 hours later. So he sets into motion this idea that maybe tonality doesn't have to be there. And I want to play you a little example of this. The prelude from Tristan und Isolde, which is just beautiful. But I hope, if you haven't heard this before, I hope that I will do you justice here. By the way, I will, Ardith, wherever you want me to, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint slide afterwards. So any of you, and the links, by the way, to the music are in there. So if you want to go back and listen to some of this music, not playing from my computer, and you'll hear it better, I'll share that with you afterwards. Hold on. Guess I got to play this again. Oh. All right, here's the beginning of Wagner, Tristan und Isolde. Oh, let's rewind this. Hopefully, just from that little piece that I played there, you can hear that these are chords that are leading us into a world of tension. And of course, it fits the storyline of the opera really well, right? We have these two star-crossed lovers whose love can never be truly consummated in life because of external circumstances. And so the resolution of this tension, the amalgamation of their love, doesn't happen until after the end when they're both dead. And then Wagner reduces it. So he's mapping this tension-laden music to the psychological and sexual tensions of the opera itself. So we also had, in the early part of the 20th century, a composer who was interested in the idea that maybe metrical time could be dispensed with in music. So Olivier Messian is a French composer. He's a prisoner of war, writing in a camp, German camp, 1940, 1941. And he composes a piece called Quartet for the End of Time. And Messian was a devout Catholic. He even stated that while he was in the camp, due to malnutrition and generally poor treatment, he had visions like the visions of the angel in the book of Revelation in chapter 10. But the title of the quartet is actually not referring so much to that, but to his interest in the idea that metrical time, that is music with a steady beat, might be dispensed with. So with Wagner, with Messian, and also with a composer called Arnold Schoenberg, there was sort of an apocalypse of two factors in instrumental music that had been essential building blocks since the days of since the Renaissance period, really, when tonality was first formulated. The idea of tonal, tonic and dominant needing to resolve, and the idea of time, metrical time needing to happen. Those experienced sort of an apocalyptic moment where they went away. And so that's one thing that I'm very interested in, is studying how these two important building blocks, had an apocalyptic ending and then a sort of transfiguration as to what came after that. I won't play this example now just because of time, but it's a beautiful excerpt. So what other kinds of things then are in this study, in this book that I'm doing? Well, of course, there are compositions inspired by the book of Revelation itself, right? Pieces that the composers have directly cited Revelation as an inspiration or have set text from it. Certain kinds of drone music. This is a piece that I won't play either, but there's this William Basinski's Disintegration Loop. So this is a really interesting story. He is a composer, and in the 1980s, he had made recordings on old magnetic tape, the reel-to-reel magnetic tape, and he had stored these away. 20 years plus later, he was wanting to archive those, to store them into some kind of digital format. So he loaded up his recordings on these reel-to-reels, but the tape had gone bad. And actually, while the tape was passing over the record head, and he was trying to archive this, the magnetic film was disintegrating off of it. So in the process of trying to archive his own music, he destroyed it. And he ended up making a composition out of it that he dedicated to September 2001, to the 9/11 tragedy. And you can hear, if you go to this YouTube video, you'll have it afterwards, an hour long, over the course of an hour, you can hear this music of his, which starts off sort of melodic, just disintegrate to the end, where all you hear is this tape hiss. And then finally, everything that I do from my sort of scholarly side and my research side, ultimately I wanted to inform my own creative work. What I do as a guitarist or as a conductor or as a composer. And so I have started to commission new pieces that are based on some aspect of apocalyptic thinking. And so one of the first of these was by a colleague of mine, Derek Keller, who's a composer that's currently up in Oregon at Southern Oregon University. And this drawing here that you see is something from the medieval period, from a very interesting apocalyptic writer named Joachim of Fiore. And these three rings here refer to the age of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Joachim was very interested in the Trinity, obviously, but also in how he thought history was structured in certain epochs: the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Holy Spirit. The age of the Holy Spirit, he believed, was going to happen soon, in his lifetime, or actually a little bit after, and that would be sort of the apocalyptic end that would then usher in a new heaven here on earth. And so I thought I'd play just a little bit of this so you can maybe get an idea. All right, hold on. Let's see if we do this a little easier here. Put this up here. So this is from a live performance. So it's me playing guitar and Derek doing video imagery of these three rings. And he also is using, as a kernel of musical information, a song by Bob Dylan called "The Times They Are A-Changing." So hence the title of this is "The End Times They Are A-Changing." Well, maybe that's enough of a little taste of it. But again, I can send that to you so that you can take a listen. And there are other pieces. That's just an example of one of them. We just did a piece at the university a couple weeks ago, recorded for 10 players, including many of the Philharmonic. That was a piece that kind of is based on ideas coming out of this. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in, is just finding a way, how can these old apocalyptic texts, you say, written 2,000 years ago, how can they inspire new artistic creation? Because no matter what you think of the book of Revelation, whether you like it or not, you can't argue that it hasn't resulted in a lot of beautiful artwork, right? From illuminated manuscripts in the medieval period to cathedral ceilings to tapestries. And it's also lent so much that the imagery, the symbolism of Revelation is so powerful that even if you're religious or not, some of those images are in our modern consciousness. So I think that it does have a great possibility for new artistic exploration. And to me, of course, that's one of the most hopeful expressions of humanity. So Ardith, I think I'll stop right there. It's about 5 till 2. And of course, I could go on for a long, long time about all things apocalyptic, but it seems like this might be a good point to take a break and just have some questions or discussion. What do you think? Does that sound good?
Yeah, Judith has a question.
Okay, Judith, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm wondering where you see the difference between the believers, the fundamentalists, those who believe in the left behind group, which we know in our community is fairly large.
Mm-hmm.
And so those for whom this is a fundamental core belief, you might know that Hasker Davis and a former post-grad that was working with him did a study and found that a lot of the fundamentalists particularly in the South, shared characteristics about educational level, health, etc., that were indicative of beliefs. I mean, those two things went together, versus what you're talking about, which is kind of using a motif, which obviously, as you said, has been very rich. If you see those two communities continuing to exist, or one expanding faster than the other,
Yeah.
if I phrased that well, I don't know.
I think I got to it. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Judith. So, yeah, certainly we do have, and I think that it's almost irregardless of educational level or level of wealth. You have, say, fundamentalist Christians who are fabulously wealthy, and you might think, well, why are these people holding an apocalyptic worldview? Certainly, they're not a group in crisis, right? They're not experiencing social justice, oppression, or poverty or anything else. But I think that any group, you could be very wealthy and have everything materially that you want, but you might feel that you're in the moral minority. You might feel that the world is growing, that morality is declining everywhere, and that's the reason for crisis. That as a fundamentalist, say Christian, you are feeling persecuted in a way because of your beliefs. So, yeah, talking about polls, there's an interesting. Well, I should back up. There's different interpretive stances of the book of Revelation, right? For myself, I feel the same way as many early medieval exegetes is, that Revelation is not a book that is talking about literal end times events, right? The sun isn't literally going to fall from the sky and the seas won't all burn up and you know, that everyone will war against each other. For me, it's, and as they thought, it's a spiritual, it's an allegorical interpretation of the presence of good alongside evil in the church and everywhere at all times. So that's what they thought it was about in the early medieval period, that, hey, look, this is a book that's talking about the need for oneself to always just sort of be on guard in your own heart about your role in the world and not being led down a stray path. On the other hand, you have a belief that's called premillennialism, which is an interpretive strategy of revelation that's very futurist. The idea that, you know what, yes, all of these things in the book of Revelation are things that are going to happen literally in the future, and that future is probably imminent, right? It doesn't, no one gets too crazy about it. If you go up to someone and say, hey, look, the world is going to end in 200,000 years and you better mend your ways, most people would probably say, well, you know, that's kind of a long time. I think I don't need to mend my ways quite yet. I'll carry on for a bit and then mend them down the road. But a lot of times the thing with this belief is that it's going to happen soon, right? Even though Jesus himself, you know, he says, you know, no one knows the time when the Son will return, right? But apocalyptic thinking generally is that, hey, you know, this could happen really soon. We need to be right-minded, because what if this happens tomorrow, right? And then, of course, there's this idea about the rapture as well, which has, you know, that's not a biblical doctrine at all. It was invented in the 19th century, but it's very popular now in certain groups as well. So I hope that some of that kind of thinking will die down a bit. I think it was very prominent, especially around the turn of the millennium. That's when those books by Tim LaHaye came out, the Left Behind books. And I think there's still a lot of people that hold those beliefs by default, because there are a lot of Bibles, the Schofield Bible, which was published in 1918 or something, or maybe even earlier. No, earlier than that, 1911, I think, had notes at the bottom of the Bible, interpretive notes that held that kind of imminent viewpoint. And so a lot of generations grew up reading the notes to that Bible and saying, oh yeah, you know what, that is what this passage says. So I think there's a lot of mixed thinking about it. It's fascinating to me what people's viewpoints of it are. But I think it's hard to characterize which segments of society hold these different beliefs. You just never know for sure. That's a great question. Thank you, Judith.
John?
Yeah, Colin, I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation.
Oh, you're welcome, Don.
You and I were exchanging emails back in the before times, before when we thought you'd be presenting in person.
I wish I could be there in person. I'll have to come back once this is over.
Well, thank you for persevering, and thanks, Ardith, for arranging it all, and Judith. A question regarding the performance we just saw. What is the balance between your improvisation in producing the sounds versus the composer telling you exactly what kind of a sound or feeling he wants you to produce?
Yeah, so almost all of that piece is very specifically notated. Like in that section that you just saw, it's exactly notated what I'm supposed to play. There's no improvisation at all. So what he has, the way he structured it is he has this suite of movements. So there are, I think, 7 different movements, and I have to play those. And within each movement, it's precisely notated. But I have choices about what order I want to put them in. So for each performance, I might say, I'm going to do the 7 in this different order. And then there are short linking passages between each movement that I can improvise. Okay. So it's mostly notated, and then he's doing the same thing. He's controlling the video. Now, obviously, what you just saw was more of a post-produced thing. There aren't images literally flying in the air, right? But people are watching this video, and he is doing things with the video to respond to the way I'm playing. So he has some triggers and things that he can do to change that based on what I'm playing. So every performance is a little bit different, but I would call it mostly a notated performance as opposed to an improvised performance.
Okay, and I love the title, "The End Times Are Changing." That
Yeah.
appeals.
Yeah, it was a fun play on words.
Well, that last piece with the video effects kind of took me back to my rock and roll days in the late 60s when we would play with all kinds of video effects splashing across our faces and backgrounds behind us. It was fun. It's fun. Kind of brought back some memories.
And you know what's interesting with that piece too, Ardith, is he, so you'll notice that in part of the title, Derek calls it socio-multimedia, because people can log into a website on their cell phone and he will send you random videos during the performance. And so I think the metaphorical idea is that the idea of an apocalypse is, of course, group oriented, right? It's something that's going to happen to everyone. But each of us, if we think about the ends of our own individual lives and what will happen afterwards, that's kind of a personal apocalypse. And so I think the idea is that each person experiences the piece a little bit differently if they decide to engage with their phone. So it's kind of fun. It's a lot of aspects to it.
Jim?
Where does nuclear holocaust or climate disaster fit in the apocalyptic schemas?
Those both figure prominently in what I would call a secular rebooting of the term. I mean, when I think of apocalyptic, I'm thinking of it in its religious context, because that's where it comes out of, right? But in the modern day world, that term, apocalypse, has been divorced from its theological setting. And it can mean just any bad thing that happens, right? A week ago, we were all in the snow apocalypse, right? So Jim, yeah, those two aspects are both very popular in kind of fictional tellings about the end of the world, right? If you think about, of course, during the Cold War, nuclear holocaust was something that was very much on people's minds. And so you have a lot of fiction. I think of like Arthur Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz in the 1950s, novels that are based on what happens to the world after this big nuclear holocaust. And then, of course, climate change is also, I think, especially now, a very popular one. So if you look at current secular manifestations of apocalypse or dystopia, these are two terms that get intermingled a lot these days. Those are both very popular. I would say those two, and then of course the idea that technology somehow rises above us, right? Artificial intelligence becomes smarter than we are and takes over our lives and does bad things, like in the Terminator.
And the whole pandemic, the third.
Absolutely.
Here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, I was, so I told you I published Cambridge Companion to Apocalyptic Literature last year, right around the time the pandemic started. And on the one hand, I was really bummed out because normally publishers, they advertise academic books like that at all these conferences that they do, right? That's where they start to sell the books. And so it was really sad that there were no conferences last year and that they weren't able to do that. But on the other hand, I think, my gosh, maybe more people are interested in this idea of end of times thinking as a result of what we just went through the last year, right? Not only from the pandemic, but from all kinds of other things, right? Death of George Floyd and so forth. So yeah, I think it's very much on people's minds. Oh yeah, Neville Shute on the beach. That's a great one.
Mhm.
That's also from around the same time as Canticle for Leibowitz, right? Must be like late 50s.
Let's see, anybody else got a thought before we close down?
Yeah,
Ruth
I
or
was
Marty?
gonna ask,
Go ahead. Is that you, Marty? Marty and Wendy both?
Marty, go
Let me-
ahead.
Okay, I have an email address, Colin, that I think you would like
Okay.
very much, and it's new to me. I was looking for a place to make a financial contribution. A member of our community recently died, and he wrote music for bowed piano, not as the end of a keyboard, but as the extension and the long life of all the things that you could do with the piano. And I went to this email address, and it's full of wonderful new music, Colin.
Mm,
And the email address is Other Minds, capital O, Other, capital M, minds.org. It's
okay.
rich and extensive. It's got all kinds of stuff. And I think you would love it. I think you would love it. And I'm also reminding you that Apocalypse Now uses Wagner for its background music.
Mhm.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you, Marty.
That group is out of San Francisco, or the Bay Area at least.
Other
that
Minds.
Marty's talking about, yes.
Well,
It
I
looks
see.
like a wonderful group. I could have spent hours, and all I wanted to do was use my visa.
Yeah, I know this website. This is great. And you know,
Other
there's a,
Minds.
yeah, and there's also, for those of you, Marty, you mentioned Wagner. There's a wonderful new book on Wagner by Alex Ross that just came out
yeah.
last year called Wagnerisms.
Yeah.
And it's great. It talks about the legacy of Wagner and how influential he was, not only on music, but on all these other arts in his own lifetime and up to today. So I strongly recommend that. I'm going to put that in the chat too for anybody who's interested. This is a good one.
Alex Ross is great.
Yeah, he is.
And he writes about new music also.
He does.
Ruth Heine, did you have something to say?
Connie?
No, I think didn't Wendy have something?
Yeah, okay, I couldn't unmute. Well, speaking of the apocalyptic theory, I think a lot about what the indigenous people think, that, you know, that we've gone from one world to another, that we've had plenty of apocalypse, and that we're moving, I think, from the fourth world to the fifth world right now. Do you work with that at all?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly interested in end of the world opinions of any group. I think in, you know, one of the things that to truly have an apocalypse, you have to have a teleological worldview, which of course Christianity is, right? Christianity doesn't believe in cyclical worldviews. There's a beginning and there's an end, and we're in the middle of it, right? And so in the Judeo-Christian, and that includes Islamic worldview, that the end of the world, the apocalypse, is literally the end of time. I mean, that's literally the end. So when you have more cyclical worldviews, which include some of these indigenous cultures you're talking about, which includes, of course, Buddhism, right? Which includes kind of the old Greco-Roman view of the age of iron and the age of bronze and the age of gold and so forth. Those are repeated beginnings. So that the way that they use the word apocalypse would be a bit different from the way Judeo-Christian people think about it. But yeah, I'm always interested to know how different groups feel about this. I read a wonderful novel recently. I'm going to put this in here. A fellow named Wabgashig Rice, who's from Ontario, wrote this novel called Moon of the Crusted Snow. And he's a member of, and I don't even want to say, I'm going to butcher his native nation name, but it's set in the North and it incorporates some of the ideas of his indigenous culture. So yes, yeah, I'm interested in it all, Ruth. I think it's fascinating. My main area of expertise, I guess, or more knowledge would be in the Judeo-Christian framework. Let's see, Wendy, is that you that has a hand raised?
Yeah, yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
do. I had trouble appreciating your guitar playing of that piece. I mean, I think I had trouble with the piece, not your playing, your performance. You know, to my ear, I think I look for something more melodic or something, I'm more stuck in some traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Interest place sometime. Do you perform locally where we could attend once that's, allowed?
Absolutely. It's allowed now, believe it or not. I do have if you like beautiful melodic music, I have a jazz trio and we play down at
jazz.
I just put my website in the link there. So if you go to my website and click on events calendar, I try to keep that pretty up to date with what I'm doing. So I have a group that plays the second Thursday of every month at the Gold Room downtown.
Yeah, I know that.
So that's a great, yeah, I do all kinds of music, everything like that piece that I just played for you. That's probably more example of more of the modernist avant-garde music that I really like. But I also do traditional classical guitar, everything from, Renaissance music through the repertoire that Segovia made famous. And then also jazz.
Oh, good. So that's great to know. The second Thursday.
Second Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. I see some folks waving goodbye. I know some of you need to sign off. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. That was really great. And I look forward, you can just email me the PowerPoint.
Should I email you the PowerPoint? I'll do that right now.
And then I'll email it to Emily, who posts this, and we can post it with.
Yeah, because at least it'll have the links in there. And so that's perfect.
It'll be fun listening to full form of some of these pieces. I'm not going to listen to all 4 hours of.
It's better to watch it. If you're gonna go through a 4-hour Wagner opera, just watch it. And then you get the action at the same time.
I'm sure that Marty will have a class on the pillar. So Tristan and Isolde will be next.
Yeah, you just had a class at Pillar, Marty.
Yeah.
Remember, was
I think my next one is on forgiveness.
Ooh.
And Mozart.
Marty?
Yes.
It's in person now?
I'm sorry.
You're on Zoom, right?
Zoom.
I just wondered if there's Zoom now. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so off we go. One by one. Connie, did you have something to add? I saw you sort of unmuting a while back.
No, I was just commenting with Marty on that. That was Stephen
Hansen.
Stephen Hansen. Stephen. His last name is different than Hansen.
Oh, that's right.
But anyway, that was. This is a group that I guess he knew something about, but that Victoria, his wife, thinks it would be a wonderful thing to contribute to. So but it is in California.
It's in the obituary.
Yeah, it's in the obituary.
Which was I think that would be great.
Which if you missed it the first time, it's in today's paper as well. It's very interesting stuff that he did.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I want to just send you one other link. So each year at UCCS, I host a symposium called Through a Glass Darkly, which is on all things apocalyptic. So it features speakers talking about everything from ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature to to the things that we're talking about today, music and more recent manifestations. There's the link. It's free, and it happens at the Heller Center up on campus. It was postponed this year till late June. So I'm hoping by late June, we'll be able to have folks in there. But that's, if you liked this subject matter, we've got a great lineup of speakers coming from all over the world. There's a fellow coming all the way from Transylvania to talk. My colleague from Montreal will be there. We also have artists, we'll have musicians sometimes. So it'll be an interesting time if any of you is interested.
All right. Well, thank you
And Colin,
Thank you, Ardith. Yeah,
Colin, did you get your black belt?
I got my black belt.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
success.
Great.
So I told my wife we have to go out for a proper dinner on the way home later today because I'll need it.
you earned it.
I'll show you. Let me see if I can find. There's a picture that she took. Let's see.
Congratulations.
Oh yeah, here you go.
Bill, do you have your black belt?
There it is.
Oh my.
There's me testing with this weapon
Oh,
called the
that's
Quantal.
beautiful.
That's great.
Oh my word.
So yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And I know that a lot of, I always feel with these things, there's so much to go through. And so I hope I didn't rush things and left ample time. But I also, I'll do one final plug. All right. If you're interested in a book that covers this more broadly, the Cambridge Companion to Apocalyptic Literature is a well, I recommend it. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
And
Drive safely.
yeah, Ardith, let's do this again in person sometime. I can come talk about a whole different subject if you want.
Okay.
I'll bring my guitar next time. How
Oh,
about
that would be great. That would be great. We could talk about the guitar.
I love to talk about the guitar. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank
you, Colin.
Thank you again.